Hi, I'm Cesar Santos. I'm hanging out today here in LA with my friend Matthew Grabelsky. I know him since when?
2006?
Four. When, no, 2005.
2005, yeah.
Yeah, when I first started at the Angel Academy. So we're like the Bouguereau hunters, no? Every time we go out, anywhere we are in the world, we're looking for Bouguereaus.
Right now we're going to the Forest Lawn Cemetery where they have this small museum that has a Bouguereau painting that we're going to go look at and talk about. Try to figure out how he painted it.
I know. I think that's the artist that I copy the most. Definitely.
I heard about him because my art professor told me that I should never try to paint like him because he's a terrible artist. And that's when I went and I looked online and I found all these paintings by him and realized that he was an incredible artist. And I definitely wanted to learn how to paint like him. And that's when I decided to move to Italy.
Turn right on Newell Street.
That was nice. So if you want to create rebels in the art world, just tell them not what not to do, and we'll do it.
Exactly. That's the best way to make you do the opposite. You always want to find things that you can do to make your work better. And it's interesting because I often find that people look at it and they have this sense that it's often like it's perfectly done. And as an artist, there's always these things that I see in my work that I want to change. And every single painting I do, I'm trying to improve it or find something new that I can add to it, do something a little bit differently. Mm-hmm. And so when I go to a museum, I'm looking for these little technical things or details or compositional ideas or colors that an artist might have used that I can try to put into my own
Turn
next
right
painting.
on South Glendale Avenue.
We're talking about a slow development that in maybe 10 years, then you can see from one to another how it grew. But it's like a baby growing. Like you don't see him growing, you know? You just add things to it to make it a better kind of person, you know, in a way.
Exactly. It's just it's a very slow development. And I think the thing that's interesting that you see when you look at a painting, and I think most people will pick up on this, is that each painter has their technique, their way of doing something that is not just random. That if they're going to paint a hand, they sit down and they have this particular way of drawing a hand or painting a hand or what colors they use or how they blend the paint. Is the paint thick or thin? But it looks like it's all planned out. But that's not something that you just sit down and do. That's the result of all these developments. That over time, you tweak all these little things and you adjust these things. Those are things you add each slowly. And
like testing and trial and error.
Yeah, changing. Maybe it works, maybe it doesn't. You try one thing, you take it out.
You crash.
Because you're talking about art, you don't realize there's a car next to you.
Cathedral Drive.
What about like the aspect of the love and the feeling for creating art, and what is it for, like, as an artist, it's kind of like a magician in a way. Like you perfect it to match your potential, but you have to take it a little bit more literal. You cannot buy into the idea that you're gonna be believing everything is feeling what you do it. Like the point is to control it almost like mechanically, but also so that then your brain can be free to feel while you're creating like the bigger picture idea.
Right, totally. I mean, I feel like when I'm doing a painting in the beginning, I'll have an idea for the painting, and that's where I'll feel it very deeply. Like I'll often wake up and I'll have this passionate idea of what I want to paint, and I'll do a sketch and I'll do a little composition and work out what I want the painting to be. I feel like with every painting, every painter has this way of doing something that seems planned out, and that's part of the enjoyment of it. Like it's not like they have a method. Mm-hmm. And that's really satisfying because it looks like it's all worked out. It's not random.
And you can feel the personality of the person, like
coming through. As an artist, you're trying to figure out your own system and make it look like it's not random.
Mm-hmm. You create a system that belongs to you because of the practice that you look for. You develop it your own, so by the time you share it, it's just the idea of it, like for other people to follow the footsteps, like the attitude of it. You know, like how do you take that? Because that's also something important to talk about, like.
Yeah, because I think sometimes people have that feeling that they're worried if another artist finds out how they did something, they can steal it. But that's not the idea. Like, every artist has their technique that's personal to them and their vision that's personal to them and the way it all comes together.
Even the masters teaching in their studios with like their students, even if they were told exactly how they did it, you still see the difference between the masters and the students.
Yeah, like even if you go to a museum and you see 10 Rembrandts and you see one painting by one of his students, and it's very clear that it's a different painter.
Yeah.
You feel like if he were to do another painting, he did 800 paintings, and if he was alive for another year and did another painting, it would still be a Bouguereau painting. If this is a painting that doesn't exist, but if it did exist, it would have the similarity to the other ones, and he would have painted it similarly to the other ones.
Yeah, let's check this out. There are universal notes that when you hear it as an artist, it's like always new.
It'll last forever. Yeah.
What do you think that is?
For me, I think that it's something I would almost say it's biological. Like we have these things that we're attracted to. Like beauty for a person. Like people are the same, and you see a flower that was beautiful 1,000 years ago, and it's going to be beautiful today. And I think it's the same thing with art. That if you can capture that kind of beauty, people in the future are still going to be people. If someday maybe there's monkeys might look at it differently, but we're particular what we find beautiful.
Yeah. It's like archetypes of things that we associate with. No?
Right.
Is that what you're talking? Yeah.
Yeah.
I think the art that lasts is the art that is beyond the artist's capacity to know what he's doing. Like there is something that you think, like let's say we are capable of only to a certain extent understand what we're doing. You know, like there is something else that there's aspect of your art that you don't even know about.
Right.
And the less you control it, the better for the, because if it's like beyond you, if you control a little bit and your result is higher, it will always stay like at that level for everybody else.
Right.
Because since we are all the same, we think that has something higher, something to look up to, and it was that also to the artist himself.
Right.
You know, like because I feel sometimes when I feel that I really know exactly what I'm doing in an art, in a piece, it stays less than me,
But
because
yeah,
I control
it prevents it from having something bigger.
Yeah,
Yeah.
there's a mystery to it that you don't even control it.
Right. I mean, I know in like even in my paintings conceptually that they all mean something to me, or I'll have an idea in why I paint a particular animal head on a body. But usually I find that the most interesting things about the paintings is when they take a life of their own afterwards, and I'll show it to people and they'll point out something in it that's more interesting than what I thought of it. I had no idea. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that's the other thing about like talking about Bouguereau, that I know like we love Bouguereau, and there's a lot of painters who are into realism just love Bouguereau because he had this amazing ability to paint realistically, but also it has this conceptual sense. Like if you look at an arm, it actually doesn't look like a photograph of an arm, but then when you see one, it feels so real. And I think there's this tendency to look at that and be like, oh, I would just want to learn how to paint exactly like him. Mm-hmm. And that was my feeling when I first went to Italy when we were studying there. But at the same time, like I think that you can't do that as an artist, because even if you knew Bouguereau and he taught you how to paint, your paintings wouldn't end up looking like a Bouguereau.
Well, his wife kind of closer, but you can still see the difference.
And that's the thing. Like I think when you look at these paintings, it's like it's great to look at them and see all these little things and try to incorporate these into your own work, but it's always an interpretation. Like it's you're never just gonna be him, and that's good. You
shouldn't. And that's why actually when you try too hard to be him, then you look like you're mimicking someone.
Right.
You know, and it's good for me. It's like a guide. Like Burrow is something to look forward to as an abstract idea of perfection, of like high quality expression, you know?
Right, especially as an artist, because we're always trying to make our work perfect. Every time you start a painting, you have this idea that it's going to be the best thing you've ever done.
And I guess you closer to excellence, like, you know, and people
each
see it. People see the difference, but for you, you're still inferior to that thing. And I'm sure to himself too, because Burrow was a great admirer of Raphael.
Yeah,
you can see the influence, and it's like you were saying, he doesn't look like he's mimicking it. He's not copying it. He's just inspired by it.
I mean, it's another interesting thing when you think about that, because every artist has always been looking at these other artists and taking things and then creating their new things. We're here in Los Angeles, and Bouguereau was most inspired probably artistically by Raphael, and so was Walt Disney. So you look at the way this mosaic of this Raphael painting, you see all these curvy shapes and the way the figures are curved. You look at an arm and it looks like it's made out of circles almost. And that was exactly how early Disney movies were all animated that way, from the influence from looking at Raphael. Really often the gardens can be formal, but the landscape feels like it's this mix between nature and people. So like people planted these olive trees, but then the olive trees grew wild. So even though they're in a row, it still has a sense of nature. And then people come back and they'll prune the olive trees and build a building nearby, and then the rock will start to have stuff growing on it, and it'll look like it's naturey. And that's this cool intermix between nature and human. I feel like art's a similar thing. Like almost even in our ideas, like we try to organize our ideas in a painting, and we have an idea for composition and we want it to be a certain way, but then our subconscious takes over when we're painting, and the brushstroke might have a way that the paint spreads out, or that there's like a little color that you didn't think about mixed in there.
Yeah, we're trying to make something look natural, but like we're totally being human about it, like being mechanical about it.
Exactly,
like,
yeah. Because a painting, it's like we're talking about magic, that it has a sense of like it looks real, like you look at and it's real, but it's not. The whole thing is done premeditated, putting things exactly where we want them. And there's that amazing thing where it works out that you look at it, it feels natural, even though it's not natural, and where you hide the tricks of how it's done.
That's true, how everything is interconnected. Like we're feeling here that this is artistic. Like this garden has elements that are connected to our art and good art, and it's interesting how the human can control nature and move it around to make that balance between the control idea of a garden, which is wild nature, but controlled environment.
Completely. Even with yourself, like when you're painting, maybe something comes up, you have a new idea. That if you're too controlled, you're going to miss something that's really interesting that you never think of doing sitting down at the beginning. All right, let's go over and check out this Bouguereau because it's really amazing.
Wow. So it's where here?
It's right here. So hard to pick a parking spot. So you have over here on this foot, just look at all the things going on. Each of the toes are rendered, and then you have this area underneath the ankle. You see the ankle bone, and then underneath the ankle you see the shift in color where it becomes a little bit green, which is the blood showing through the fair skin, the veins, and all of these little forms in the foot are so carefully paid attention to. But at the same time, the overall foot is not just like a bunch of details. Like you see this overall foot, and when you look at the whole thing, those are so subtle. You have to stare at them to even see that they're there.
Why is it that by hand is different, and why is it that it looks different? Because if this was a photo printed with all these people doing that,
it wouldn't have the same.
Nobody would come to see it, like obviously. So, what's that difference that is so subtle but is so big?
I think that it's twofold. Like part of it is conceptual, that we know that somebody painted this, and there's just the knowledge that somebody did something makes it more amazing to us. But then if you were to analyze it visually, it doesn't look exactly like a photograph. That if you were to look at a photograph of, for example, a hand, you would zoom in, you'd actually see pores in the skin, and you would see
like the shiny and the glare.
And he's making it, he's almost doing this trick, like we're talking about a magician, that he's making it look like it's realistic. You look at this and you think it's photographic. But if you actually analyze it and you put a photograph of the same baby next to it, it wouldn't actually look the same. And I think even somebody, like we're very sensitive to it because we're painters and we think about this all the time. But I think that even somebody who had no experience, if you actually had a photo of that same baby right next to the baby in the painting, I think you would immediately see the difference. So for example, if you look at the arms of the baby, it's very composed. So it's in this perfect pose where you can draw these curving lines around, and that's partly what makes it interesting artistically. But there's a lot of exaggeration in the arm where it's very thin at the wrist, and then it gets thick, and then it gets thin, and then it gets thick at the forearm.
The natural forms are being stated like they're...
And it's done artistically, but then it's also rendered very realistically, so it makes you think when you first look at it that it's photographic. But actually it's not. And I think it's that subtlety is what makes it so visually exciting to look at.
And one of the things that we're always tricked by, and I don't know if maybe it's because our vision is so naive, but the value composition. People might think that this is real, but we don't see like that. Like we can appreciate it when it's presented by a master, but in reality, and that's why it's hard for everybody to paint. Like it's easy to see this and say, okay, it's like a photo, like nature, and why not copy it? And this is boring. But the moment you try it, then it doesn't come out. So the same way that you're saying how the flesh is being idealized and presented in this most pure form by the idea of the individual artist doing it, also the values and colors are presented like that too, but we don't think about it literally. You see a dark place and you see it dark, but the folds within, or the information within that dark area is being subdued, and we don't realize it unless you're like a painter that knows how to do it. Like it's a weird thing, no?
Right. I mean, if you look at this painting again, you look at it initially and you think this is very realistic, but actually if the light were striking these people this bright in this direction, there would also be things around it in the background that would be lit up and would be very bright and distracting. So there would probably be spots of light that would be falling down on the ground. You might see on these leaves were actually as bright as the lights on the chest of the baby. There would be probably little bits of light shining through the trees in the background, and distractions that make it that would take away from the power,
from the main idea.
Right, and that's the great thing about actually painting, is that you control all these things physically. Like you are with a brush mixing up a color and putting it down where you want it to be. So as you work over this whole painting bit by bit, you're making things a little bit lighter, a little bit darker, comparing, saying, okay, I want this area, Bouguereau might have wanted this area over here to be darker than it actually is, so that you would see something in the center where it's light more strongly.
Yeah, yeah, no, that's very interesting. I like that. And what do you think of that idea to compare to how we normally behave in nature? That we are guided, our eyes is almost guiding us through life.
Absolutely. Like this is almost closer to vision, because when you're walking and you're walking in the woods, for example, maybe you see a squirrel and it grabs your attention. You look at the squirrel and you don't notice all the other things around it.
But
you're
if you
focusing.
take a picture of the squirrel, maybe the leaf next to it is catching a highlight, and then it dominates the overall
Absolutely.
idea.
And I don't know how many times I've done that, where I'll see from my balcony, I'll see a bird, like a bird will land on my balcony, and it's amazing and it's colorful. So I get my camera, I get my phone, I take a photo of this, and I'm going to send it to somebody. I look at it, and you can barely see it. It's not that interesting.
Yeah.
And
So as an artist, how do you the goal is to translate that feeling of that bird getting there, or something you saw in nature that guided your eyes, and you say, okay, how do I filter all this other stuff and put it into context to give that presence to the main element.
And I think that's where technique comes in, because the technique is the language. So you see this, you have this as an artist, you have this artistic feeling, like something is interesting enough that you want to paint it. So for you, you see this girl and she has this face, and there's something about that makes you want to paint it. For me, I see somebody and I imagine them with an animal head, and I want to paint them sitting with an animal head. And that's the initial spark, and that's what you want people to get from your painting. But then as an artist, your technique comes in how do you actually make that interesting so that they have the same experience that you had when you first had this idea. How do you focus them on this face? How do you focus them on this figure and not look at things you don't want them to look at, to maybe look at this face is really interesting, the hands are really interesting, but then the background you want to not be paying attention to the way that you imagined it as an artist.
Yeah, we have that in a way differently, like you add stuff around it that doesn't compete with the main subject, but you still have the details around it.
Right.
And I simply avoid it. Like I say, this is my main element and the surrounding is abstracted or like absent or something. Like
right, and that's the interesting thing about painting. There's a million different ways that you can create this very simple, similar thing about there's something you're interested in, and then there's the surrounding that is not, that you don't want to be distracting. And you can do it the way you do it. You put the person in the middle, and then you have this really interesting painterly stuff that really captures the paint. Like these are like, you'll have this one painting that you did, you had this girl with a lot of makeup that was huge, with this really like kind of clown makeup. It was really interesting, and then her hair had these palette knife abstract strokes that are really interesting when you get close up, and then you see the linen and it smooths out into the linen. For me, and I'm very influenced by Bouguereau, as are you, but I love the way that he has these complete scenes with all this detail. So when I paint somebody sitting on the subway with an animal head, I put in all these details around, similar to how he has this whole forest around his painting. He has the figures are sitting on this pedestal with all these carvings, but then they're all played down. So it's another way to do it, where you do have all that stuff, but then you're using colors and blending and keeping values similar, so there's not too much contrast where you don't want your eyes to see.
Do you think he had like pre-mixed colors like we do that he would use often, or for flesh or stuff like that, or you think he just went like original colors
just mix it up as
and
he
then
went?
just mix it as a paint? How do you think?
It's hard to know about him. I know that you can read about other painters from that time, like Whistler, for example, who was a very different painter, but you can read where it said that he would mix up his colors before doing a painting and spend more time mixing the colors than painting. For Bouguereau, it's possible, because during the time they had the same paint, these aluminum paint tubes, was when those were first commercially available. So he definitely could have done
Pre-mix it, yeah.
So I would say that it makes sense that he would have, because for me, I know it saves me a lot of time and makes my painting better. For him, he might have done it.
And to keep that unity though, because Whistler is more of a guy that it feels like going, it's more about that attitude of building the painting as it goes. So it matches that idea of having the virgin tints, the pure colors, and mixing into them as it goes. But something about Burrow is so unified, it's so controlled, that maybe that it needs that premeditated, pre-mixed kind of things to have it controlled,
But at the same time, I could totally imagine that he just mixed them as he went, and he was just able to control them so well. Like that's we don't know. Like without actually having somebody finding some letter that said this is how Bouguereau painted. It's very classical to show the actual figure underneath the drapery. Again, like
Yeah.
if you were
You almost
actually
can see like almost the gastrocnemius,
Yeah.
like the calf
Yeah,
muscle
yeah.
there. Drapery was meant to hang, and since drapery has no form of its own, the idea of representing drapery back then was very different from our idea now. Before, it was a tool to show to describe the form underneath. And it would be very important to show the points where its attention points were hanging, and where how the folds will move from where it's resting and
a good point.
what it's covering.
Yeah.
It was incredible. I mean,
Yeah, because if you think about this scene, it looks so natural, but if you were actually to have three or four figures and you got costumes with wings and you had this drapery and you had a baby and they actually sat down, it wouldn't look
It would be a
nearly
mess.
this. It would be a mess. You wouldn't be able to see the leg through. It would be all distracting. It wouldn't look graceful.
I would like to talk a little bit about the aspect of the feeling and the purpose of a painting that is universal.
Sentimentality, the sense of human feeling, got a bad name for a while because fashions always change. But in this painting, I think what keeps it universal and what keeps a lot of paintings art from the past universal is it appeals to these very core elements of who we are as people. So I'm not religious, but Bouguereau was Catholic and very religious, so it was important for him to paint this scene with the Virgin Mary and Christ. But for me, I look at this painting and I think about my life. I think about my mother, who's very close and always been very supportive. And I think about the people around me who helped raise me, my family, our family, our friends. And then this child in the center just totally at rest, comfortable, feeling protected, feeling safe.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that everybody's had a mother, everybody can relate to that.
And also the idea of taking care of the most important thing, which is the future, because that's what a baby represents. It represents the
Right.
future. So it's like all these grown-ups, all these adults looking at the center and taking care of the possible future.
Right.
And trying to caress it and build it in a way that it will be better for humanity.
We say technique as if it's this separate thing that you just work on and you like learn technique and then you know your technique. But technique is very central to how you create an image. That technique, you can't isolate technique from the idea. They have to come together to work.
How you treat the subject, and it's true. Like, how do you treat it? What elements do you use to narrate the story? So that's basically the same idea.
Exactly,
Yeah.
totally. You look at a foot in Bouguereau, and each of the toes, you can very clearly see the form. Like you can see where the top of the toe, and then it bends around the joint, and then it comes up on the bottom part of the toe, and then it wraps around the nail. And you see that in the painting, and you're kind of amazed by how clear it is. And then you look at the sculpture. It's a great learning lesson because you look at this foot, and you can actually, if I could touch it, I could
Yeah.
feel it. But you can actually see all those different shapes on the foot. And especially because it's white, you often don't see that. And if you look at an actual foot, often there's the different colors in the foot and lights coming from different direction, and it's hard to actually look at and see where those
Like,
different forms
exactly,
are.
yeah,
But in
everything-
the sculpture, it simplifies it.
Since we are bombarded with digital imagery, like images and from movies or photos, whatever, we lost that idea of the form. So by the time we study it, we exaggerate it because it's like new to us. But what about the idea that Bouguereau was training and he would have models or like this? So he never had a digital image in his life, like to contaminate his
Right,
visual. So
right.
maybe he would look at this and then interpret that the foot is that. So you know what I'm saying? So then his paintings look more sculptural
Because that was the only other thing that he knew.
because that's the only reference that they
Right.
had. Like,
Yeah, I mean, I think it definitely today, it's amazing that we have access to any image. Like, you can sit on your phone, no matter where you are, you can look at an image of anything. If I want to know, especially me, I paint animals. If I would never be able to know what this animal in the jungle in Africa looks like, or this other animal I painted a kangaroo, and I could go to a zoo, but I would never know what is a kangaroo like when it's jumping through the outback in Australia.
Yeah, but that's
and
the positive side.
That's a positive side. The
But the
negative
negative,
side,
yeah.
right, and that's great. But the negative side is that there's so much information. It's hard to synthesize that and make one simple thing. It's so easy to be distracted by all different kinds of images, all different. You look at it. You can look at photographs. You can look at paintings. You can walk down the street. You can look at advertisements. You can look at a magazine. And it almost makes your job harder because
Yeah,
it's
you
hard to
need to-
concentrate.
because you have an empty canvas and you have to select things to put in, and there's so much options with so many ways to put it that it's harder. And maybe before it was simple, it was less to get access to images. So by the time they did it, it was like very selective and very like planned. Do you think?
Right. I mean, I think that gets to the idea of editing, which is you always you want to edit out. You have this idea, you have all this information in the beginning, and then you need to almost edit out everything you don't need, and put in just the things you need. And I know even in my own paintings sometimes, I'll have done, and often it's something, it's like a circumstance where, say I have a show and I don't have a lot of time to do a painting for this show, I might do a simpler painting, and then it actually ends up to be a better painting that people respond better to. And it's, for me, it was because I didn't have time to put in all this different stuff that I would normally put in, or I might just do a single figure that's simpler, but that's actually a better painting in the end.
The difference between a photo and a painting, there's sometimes, even if they end up being similar in idea, they're so different in conception. Like, for instance, photography, you have everything that you deal with and you just crop it. And in painting, you start with nothing and you add to it.
We have all this technology, and with Photoshop and with digital editing, digital imagery, it really blurs the line where you can have a photograph that's somewhere in between a painting and a photo, because you can do so much digitally, and that's a whole other art form. And I think I know, like, both of us in our work often use Photoshop at some point to help figure out our composition, or to get ideas of how we're going to paint something. And that's the interesting thing today, where even though we're painting with oil paint, which is hundreds of years old, we're still keeping it new. Even our technique is new because we're incorporating new technology, or doing painting in different ways that people wouldn't have been able to do at Bouguereau's time or at Rembrandt's time, or when.
And that also gives room for people to judge us, because the people that are influenced by classical painting and want to rescue that purity, and we are contaminating it by using contemporary stuff that are available to us, and it's like, or either, oh, you project something, or you use Photoshop, and what is that? You're not really, what do you think about that?
Right, no, it's interesting because I think not everybody knows this argument, but we both came out of this classical school in Florence, and there's a group of schools that are trying to really get back to how art was done 500 years ago or hundreds of years ago, which is great. I mean, it was amazing to do that, but a lot of people then have this bias that if you use anything that artists weren't using back then, that is cheating. That, like, if you're using a photograph, it's cheating.
It's almost like simplicity, It's almost like saying, if they use this, I must use whatever they use. If I don't, I'm not being loyal to that. Instead of saying, no, you are loyal because the principles and the the overall,
the ideas, what they were doing. And the reality is that they were doing what we're doing, that they were always incorporating new technology, that oil paint at some point was new technology, and then they had photographs that in the 19th century were new technology, and those were incorporated into paintings. The artists started using photographs as references. There's been a lot of talk about Vermeer. Did he paint from a camera obscura? But certainly there are optical effects, like these blurry highlights, even if he wasn't using it to paint with. Never seen before, that he clearly was at least looking at optical effects that were giving him at lenses that were giving him new ideas to paint. And I think that in a sense, like, it's actually true to the quote unquote classical way of doing things, to keep reinventing and using new technology.
And that's not to be taken wrong, in the sense that we're not saying that if you want to only use natural light and paint only from nature and not use any technology, that's a bad thing either.
We first learned how to paint just from a model, and when we were in Florence, we were sitting there like they were doing hundreds of years ago. We had our canvas set up, we were doing a drawing, we were painting it, there were no cameras involved. But then as we went on, I think that what keeps art interesting is that you're always inventing and incorporating new things. And especially, it's the brain, and especially when you're working, I think, like, as an artist, your materials always affect what you end up producing, in the sense that this artist was working in marble, and the fact that marble's hard, the fact that it's sparkly when you smooth it out, all of those things affect what the actual work looks like in the end. And I think, as an artist, it's, if you want to create something that is made possible by different materials, that's a great thing. Like, for me, I have all these paintings of people on the subway. I can't sit on the subway, and I guess it's possible if I were a millionaire and I could have somebody build a subway car for me. But
super limited.
I would be very limited in my expression. That if I'm in New York and I have this idea for something I want to do, using this technology allows me to create my vision, which is that's what's true to me as an artist.
Well, since we're close by, do you want to check out your studio? Do you mind, like, showing us your process?
Yeah, absolutely. Let's go by and I can show you some of the stuff I'm working on.
Tell me a little bit about your concept. What you're thinking about, what you're painting.
I got back after Florence, and I started painting. I really like mythology, and I was looking at all these paintings in museums of these Greek myths. So I did this one giant painting of a Greek myth. And it actually came out of something we were talking about, because you were always telling me, like, this is something that doesn't matter today, this isn't relevant. Like, we were walking in New York one day, and you were like, look around you, like, this is the world you live in, like, why aren't you painting this? Yeah. And at the time, my feeling was like, I don't want to paint that. I want to paint these stories that I fell in love with when I got interested in painting.
And we used to talk about stuff like this while riding the subway towards the
museum.
And,
and later on, this whole series started for me because I was living in Paris, and I was still trying. I was doing these little studies and like painting little still lifes and going to museums and trying to study technique.
And you used to work with animals, like do animal sculptures.
I used
before.
to do these sculptures. Yeah,
incredible. Like we're gonna show you some images now of those animals that you were doing with chicken wire.
It was with this like wire mesh that I would sculpt.
I'm always talking about how important it is to look at your past to develop the style. That sometimes we think that the style is something in the future that you need to invent, instead of saying, this is who I am.
Right.
Yeah, I'm part of this. What do I get elements from my past, and how do I put it in a better way?
Right. I mean, for me, I realized that it was this common. Like, I always loved mythology, but this animal thing came out of. I realized when I was in LA. I was living in LA already. I'd moved back to LA, and my mom was visiting, and we were trying to figure out something to do that day. And she said, "Why don't we go to the zoo nearby?" Because we apparently, and I didn't remember this, we used to go to the zoo when I was a kid. Well, I remember parts of it, but we used to go to the zoo when I was a little kid. And so we went to the zoo, and I realized when I got there that this must be why I'm drawn to painting animals, that this is this place that I spent a lot of time when I was a kid with looking at animals and drawing animals. And I think like what you're saying, that as an artist, it's not really that you're pulling something out of thin air and inventing a new idea. It's we each have this particular character, where we grew up, what we were interested in, what we saw when we were a kid, what we used to do at different times in our life, and it's really about taking all of that raw material and then creating something unique to you. I always try to tell some kind of a story in each painting and then let people make what they want out of it. So like this one here with these two dogs, these are actually friends of mine who modeled for me in my studio in LA. They weren't actually on the subway. And I love the sense that they're just sitting together, these like young couple sitting together, and they're both looking at something that's outside of the painting, passing by the window that they're both interested in, and we have no idea what that is.
Can we talk about the animal in the room that is not an elephant, but it's actually a funny animal? What was the idea of that? Because I loved it so much too. After we talked about it, you did the first one by yourself, and then I wanted one, so you did one for me, and we traded pieces. But that was so interesting. So can you?
So this painting actually, this painting I actually kept because I love the painting, and because for me, actually, as a technical thing, I really like the skin colors. So I often have this out when I'm painting as a reference. But and then I did this other one for you because we traded, so now I have one of yours, which I look at all the time as well, and I study that. In Greek mythology, the satyr or Pan is the god of music. And so when we were in Florence, you had these bongos that you brought, that you had this band you would play, and you'd play the bongos every week, and then you'd sometimes just be out in like a square in Florence playing the drums, and people would come around and start dancing. Yeah. So this I was like, okay, that's perfect. Like I could see you as like this Greek god, but like in New York in the subway. And I love this sense that the view is you're like on the platform looking into the subway. And it's this view where the subway is going to go by. You're never going to see the person again, so you can really stare at them without worrying that they're going to be mad at you because they're in the subway. They can't get out.
That's funny. I like that. Yeah. We can get fooled by the superficial aspect of things, and we see it from the outside, and it's tough. How do you build up a painting? Can you share a little bit about that?
So for me, it usually goes through a few different stages. So the first one is I have an initial idea, which is often, in this case, for example, I'm thinking, okay, I have these two dogs, and I want them to be on people. So I have people model for me, and I take a bunch of photos of them, and then afterwards I'll go through the photos, and usually there's one pose or sometimes a couple that'll just pop and that really have something interesting in the way that they're sitting. Once I have the references, I'll usually do some kind of like a Photoshop composition to work out more or less how I want the painting to
work.
Colors overall, and that's like the conceptual stage, and that's really the what I think of as a composition where you're planning out the whole image. That's what's really going to grab you. Usually what I'll do is I'll do a few different sketches to work out colors. So this one down here, when I can grab that one, this was for this big one. So I wanted to... Yeah, so what I do is like it's very rough, brushstrokey, just really hitting the key notes in the painting so that I know when I'm doing the big painting, which are the colors I want.
And the study's pretty much like alla prima.
The study's alla prima, yeah. I do this, and that was probably a couple of hours that I just like start on this gray ground I prepare the canvas to that color.
to show the application of it. How many layers do you have like to get that finished perfect
I usually
look
do.
that you normally
Usually
get?
there's only 2 layers in a painting, and then maybe some details on top.
You're thinking local colors and general values.
Exactly.
Not much of the beauty's decoration on top
Nothing
of it.
else. Like that actually for me, the more if I put in too much detail, it makes it harder to paint over.
Yeah.
Because it gets in the way when I'm over painting.
And you spend time doing it for nothing. Like
Spend time is totally unnecessary.
yeah. You're represented by a gallery that has contemporary artworks, no?
Right. I mean, it's this gallery, this scene, and it started in LA, but it started as pop surrealism. But it's a scene that takes drawing, painting, illustration, street art, and then has created this very contemporary art scene that's not this conceptual off going and painting something that's totally strange and that most people can't appreciate. It's also not just painting beautiful flowers, and it's kind of this in between, which is really fun for me.
It's like a new breed of honesty with craftsmanship and
Right, and when we were in school, it still felt like to paint realistically, you were fighting against culture, and it was almost anachronistic and looking back to the past. Whereas now it's super trendy, and which is fun. It's fun to feel like, I haven't changed what I've been doing. I've been doing the same thing, and now people are. It's looked at as being cool, almost like pop music, which is great because it's great to see this thing that for me I love be seen by a wide variety of people and enjoyed by a lot of people.
so your career is moving along super nicely, smooth. You had an amazing show in New York and in Spain, and you did this cover for who was
It was for Moby's latest album.
Moby's album.
So I have a whole bunch of ideas of where I want to take these characters. Like I feel like I'm kind of developing my language, and these characters, these animal characters, started on the subway in New York, and now my next idea is where do they go when they get off the subway?
And you need to cook it. Like it feels like cooking. Like you cannot be changing everything drastically just because you don't want to be judged as repetitive or something. Like I find myself sometimes I do portraits and I want to do portraits and it's like, oh, why do you know, like I question myself, should I keep doing portraits? And I said I love it and I need to see how far I can take it and where to take it, and it's a slow moving thing. You cannot be doing every week a new painting that is very different from the last one. So it's like
and because it has to be natural. Like all these things, they come out. There's something that exactly like slow cooking. Like it's something that you develop for years before you finally have it in its final form. And I think it's great to look at an artist's career and see how the different works evolve. But you have to realize that this isn't, even if they have a new painting that you hadn't seen before, something totally different. That's not something most of the time that they sat down and they're like, I'm going to do something totally different. That's something they've been really working. So once it comes out, it feels deep and developed and rich.
Awesome. Well, man, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Let's wrap this video up. I'm an animal, perhaps inflammable, riding on the subway with the cannibals.